It began with a whisper, a story so grotesque that even the elders of the town refused to speak it aloud. They say there was a girl, no older than 15, who carried a secret inside her belly, a child that should never have existed. The father was not a stranger, not a neighbor, not even a distant cousin. He was her own uncle. What was born from that darkness has haunted these woods, this county, and every bloodline tied to it. People still argue whether it was madness, desperation, or something older, a sickness buried deep in the family's veins. But one thing is certain, no one ever walked away untouched. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The year was 1947. In a crumbling farmhouse on the edge of West Virginia, a family lived in near total isolation. They were poor, so poor that they shared one mattress, ate from a single iron pot, and patched clothes with scraps of burlap. Their nearest neighbor was miles away, and the dirt roads in winter made sure no one came uninvited. They were forgotten people, a clan pushed so far out of the light that even census takers often skipped their names. This was not unusual in Appalachia. What was unusual was the bloodline. Generations had stayed in the same valley, never marrying outside, never letting fresh blood in. By the 1940s, children were being born with eyes too far apart, voices that slurred words together, and minds that seemed forever trapped between childhood and something unexplainable. The county doctor, a man who'd seen his share of horrors, once told a nurse, "This isn't nature. This is what happens when secrets breed with secrets." He left soon after, never to return. And then came the girl. Some called her sweet, others said she was slow, but those who knew the truth whispered that she was prey. Her uncle, a man twice her age with crooked teeth and a gaze that lingered too long, began to visit her room at night. The family knew. Of course they knew. In a house that small, no cry could go unheard, but silence had long been their only law. Silence kept the family together. Silence kept the shame from spilling into the world, until her stomach began to swell. The first sign wasn't her belly, it was her face. Neighbors who rarely saw the family recalled that the girl's eyes seemed to dim, as if something inside her had been hollowed out. She walked with her shoulders hunched, her steps dragging in the dirt, as though the weight she carried was more than just flesh. At the time, whispers said it was sickness. Others said it was punishment, but those closest knew it was something far darker. By the time her belly had grown round, the truth could no longer be hidden. The uncle did not deny it. In fact, some say he never even tried. He sat on the porch at night with a jug of moonshine, rocking back and forth, humming songs his father had once hummed, the kind of songs that sounded more like laments than lullabies. The family kept their silence, binding themselves to him out of fear, or perhaps because shame had already stripped them of the will to fight. Outsiders would not understand, and the town would not forgive. Better, they thought, to bury the secret than to bury themselves. When the baby came, it was in the middle of winter, with snow piled high against the warped wooden siding of the house. No doctor attended, no midwife dared step inside. It was the grandmother, her hands trembling and eyes wet with unshed tears, who caught the infant as it slipped into the world. The baby did not cry, not at first. They say its eyes opened wide, wider than seemed natural, and that it stared around the room with a silence that chilled the air. Some swore that in that instant, even the fire in the hearth seemed to falter. But the child lived. Against all odds, the child lived. And with its life came the curse of a truth too unbearable to keep hidden. The girl, still little more than a child herself, now held a baby she dared not call her own. The uncle, proud in some twisted way, treated the infant as both his triumph and his posse, Sion. And the family, bound by blood, bound by fear, continued their pact of silence. The town, however, began to notice. A strange baby in a strange family. Eyes too wide, limbs too frail, a silence too deep. Something unnatural had been born, and the valley itself seemed to shiver with the weight of it. The child grew quickly but never normally. By the time it was 2, its bones seemed crooked, its words slurred into sounds that didn't belong to any language. When it laughed, the sound was sharp, almost shrieking, and when it cried, the walls of the house seemed to bend with the sound. The girl, too young to be a mother and too broken to be a sister anymore, drifted further into silence. Her eyes carried the same emptiness that once lingered in her uncle's, as though part of her soul had been carved away the moment the child was born. The uncle, however, paraded the boy through the dirt roads as though he were a badge of defiance. "Mine," he would mutter under his breath, loud enough for neighbors to hear. Some crossed to the other side of the path. Others lowered their gaze. No one spoke. In places like that, to acknowledge a horror was to inherit it. So they turned away, convincing themselves that what was happening inside that farmhouse was no different than the other tragedies buried deep in those hills. But secrets rot when left too long in the dark. By the time the boy was 5, the stories had spread. A schoolteacher, sent by the county, came once to check on the family. She wrote in her journal later, a journal never meant to be seen, that the child's stare unsettled her. "He does not blink as other children do," she wrote, and when I asked his name, he only smiled. His teeth, they looked too many. She never returned, and her absence was never questioned. The girl, now a young woman, bore another child soon after. This time, the whispers claimed, it was not by her uncle, but by her brother, a boy raised in the same warped silence. The family line, tangled beyond repair, was folding in on itself like a serpent devouring its tail. Each new child carried with it not only the weight of deformity, but the stench of inevitability. It was no longer a question of if the family would destroy itself, but when. The valley began to feel cursed. Livestock died without reason. A well turned sour overnight, and in the town square, elders began to say what no one dared say aloud. The sins of the bloodline are staining the land. By the late 1950s, the family's name had become something of a ghost story. Children dared each other to walk past the rotting farmhouse at night, swearing they saw candlelight flicker behind the warped windows. Some said they heard the sound of lullabies drifting across the fields, off-key, cracked, sung in voices that were not quite human. Others claimed they saw figures moving in the yard at dusk, stumbling and swaying as if their bones were not built for balance. The family, now numbering more than a dozen, rarely came into town. When they did, the silence followed them. Clerks in stores avoided eye contact, cashiers bagged goods quickly, and children were pulled by their mothers to the other side of the street. No one wanted to be near them, yet no one dared intervene. Fear and superstition had sealed the family's isolation tighter than any law ever could. It was around this time that a young pastor arrived in the county, fresh from seminary and full of conviction. He believed no soul was beyond redemption, no family too far gone. Against the warnings of his congregation, he walked up that dirt road, Bible in hand, and knocked on the warped wooden door. The girl, now worn, her youth long eroded by sorrow, opened it. Behind her in the shadows were children with eyes that glowed in the dim light, their faces bearing both innocence and deformity. The pastor spoke kindly, prayed aloud, and left promises of salvation. He returned a second time, a third. By the fourth, his sermons turned to silence. He stopped coming to Sunday service. His parishioners whispered. The family took him in. The valley took him whole. His name was never spoken again. From then on, even the bravest avoided the house. Hunters claimed the woods around it grew quieter each year, as if animals themselves refused to cross the boundary. The soil, once fertile, grew stubborn and dry. The air, heavy with the smell of mildew and smoke, carried an unease that pressed on the chest of anyone who lingered too long. Some families packed their wagons and left the valley altogether, refusing to raise children where such shadows lingered. Still, the farmhouse endured, weathered, beaten, sagging with rot, yet somehow still standing, as if held together by the very curse that had poisoned it. Inside, the children grew, the bloodline folded tighter, and the silence grew thicker than ever. By the 1960s, rumors of the family had spread beyond the valley. County officials, pressured by outsiders who had heard the whispers, attempted to intervene. A social worker was dispatched, armed with nothing more than a clipboard and determination. She arrived one morning in June, her car rattling up the dirt path until it stopped before the sagging farmhouse. What she found inside would never make it into any official report. Years later, in private letters uncovered by her niece, she described the scene in words that shook even seasoned investigators. She wrote of children with hair so thin it looked like spider silk, of eyes that bulged too wide for their sockets, of voices that seemed to mimic sounds rather than form words. "They did not look at me," she confessed. "They looked through me. And when they laughed, it was not the laughter of children. It was something older, something that belonged to the walls of that house more than to their own bodies." The social worker left that day trembling, her pen scratching false notes onto government forms. Healthy, stable, no intervention needed. She never returned, and within months she resigned her post. The state, content with paperwork that told them nothing was wrong, closed its file. The family was once again left to itself, but the land around them seemed to resist. Crops failed year after year, leaving fields brittle and grey. Neighbors swore they heard cries in the night, long wails that cut through the woods and echoed down the hollow. One farmer, drunk in a bar decades later, claimed he had once seen the uncle himself walking barefoot through the snow, carrying a child in his arms. "It wasn't breathing," he whispered, "but he rocked it like it was still alive." His story was dismissed as the ranting of a drunk, but those who lived nearest to the farmhouse never forgot. And yet, despite everything, the family endured. Each generation folded back upon the last, uncle to niece, brother to sister, until the bloodline became a knot too tangled to unravel. They bore children who bore more children, each one more fragile, more twisted, more silent. It was no longer a family in the traditional sense. It was something else entirely, a living reminder that some secrets, once planted in the soil, will never stop growing. By the 1970s, the story of the family had drifted into local folklore. Teenagers dared each other to drive up the hollow road at night, headlights cutting through the mist, just to see if the farmhouse still stood. Most never made it past the rusted fence. Those who did swore the house seemed to breathe, its walls pulsing as though alive, the windows reflecting faces that were not their own. Some came back shaken, pale, unable to speak of what they had seen. Others never spoke of it at all. It became a rite of passage in the county. Test your courage against the most inbred family history had ever known. Few ever returned unchanged. Inside, however, life continued as though untouched by the outside world. Children were born, children grew, children carried on the cycle. By now, the family spoke in ways outsiders could not understand. Half-muttered phrases, sounds bent into shapes that resembled language, but never quite crossed into it. Visitors described it as if the family had invented a tongue of their own, one shaped by generations of isolation and twisted blood, a language that did not belong to civilization, but to something older, something buried. It was during this time that a photographer traveling through Appalachia to capture rural poverty tried to document the family. He took 2 photographs before his camera jammed, the shutter refusing to close. In those photos, later discovered in a shoebox decades later, the children stand in front of the farmhouse, their faces blank, their eyes reflecting nothing. Some who saw the images claimed their features blurred when stared at too long, as if the film itself rejected the truth it had captured. The photographer left the county the next day and never picked up a camera again. And so the silence endured. Each new generation dug the curse deeper into the soil, binding the land and the bloodline together. Outsiders would come and go, always leaving with more questions than answers, always burdened by the feeling that they had seen something not meant for human eyes. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments. What would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed silent like they did, or would you have tried to break free? By the 1980s, what had once been rumor began to harden into something darker: evidence. A county sheriff, newly elected and eager to make a name for himself, decided to confront the family directly. He led 2 deputies up the hollow road one grey autumn morning. What they found was not a crime scene in the traditional sense, but something far worse: a vision of life collapsed inward, where morality had rotted away, and only blood remained. The deputies described children hiding in corners, their limbs too thin, their eyes wide and glassy. The smell of mildew and sickness clung to the walls. In the back room, the sheriff found a woman, or what was left of one. Her hair was grey, though her face was not yet old. Her body bore the wear of too many births, too much silence. She sat rocking in a broken chair, humming to herself while a child with a twisted spine clung to her leg. When the sheriff asked questions, she only shook her head and whispered, "We don't talk. We don't tell." The deputies begged him to file a report, to remove the children, to burn the house if he had to. But when the sheriff returned to town, he said nothing. He told his men to say nothing. Within months, he had grown pale, withdrawn, his once bold speeches replaced with silence. 2 years later, he was found dead in his own home, a gun still warm in his hand. Some whispered that he had seen something in that farmhouse that no man could carry alone. The family, untouched, continued to multiply. By this time, outsiders began to notice strange patterns in the county records: births without fathers listed, deaths without causes, names that repeated too often and too closely. It was as though the family tree had stopped branching and instead had begun circling back upon itself. Each new child was not a continuation, but a collapse. The line was consuming itself, and yet no one intervened. Neighbor, Boers still turned away. Officials still looked the other direction. The silence, passed from generation to generation, had grown heavier than law, heavier than justice, heavier than the truth itself. The farmhouse, though collapsing in on itself, remained standing, like a monument to everything the county wished to forget. By the turn of the 21st century, the farmhouse was no longer just a house, it was a scar. The roof had caved in on one side, weeds and thorn bushes had overtaken the porch, and the windows gaped like black, empty sockets. Yet still, the family lived there. Generations of silence, layered upon silence, kept them rooted to the soil that had long since given up on them. By then, the children were known simply as shadows in the woods, shapes glimpsed between trees, movements caught at the edge of headlights on a lonely road. Hunters left food offerings at the boundary of the hollow, not out of kindness, but fear. No one wanted to disturb whatever was left inside. And yet, records prove they survived. Birth certificates, faint and incomplete, still appeared in county files. Death notices too, though often with no listed cause. Doctors refused to sign them, preachers refused to bury them. They became a people outside of people, alive yet erased, hidden in plain sight. The girl who first carried the uncle's child, the one whose stomach swelled in silence all those decades before, did not live to see the new century. Some say she died quietly in her sleep. Others whisper that her body was left in the woods, returned to the earth like a secret too heavy for the family to keep. What became of her children and her children's children remains uncertain. Some believe they still wander those hills, their bloodlines stretching forward in ways no one dares trace. Others claim the farmhouse finally claimed them all, sealing itself shut with their bones beneath its foundation. But one thing is undeniable: the silence remains. Ask any elder in that county about the family, and watch how their eyes shift, how their voices falter. They will not speak of it. They will tell you to leave it buried, to let the past rot where it belongs. And yet, the stories keep surfacing. Whispers on the wind, names half-remembered, shadows that linger in photographs. The truth refuses to stay hidden. So when you hear about a girl made pregnant by her own uncle, about children born of silence and shame, remember this: you are not just hearing a story, you are brushing against a wound that never healed, a wound that still bleeds beneath the soil of Appalachia. And perhaps it was never meant to be told at all.